I think we are live now. Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is Ishan, and welcome to Karwan. Karwan, as you know, is an initiative that is trying to promote professional history in the nation where WhatsApp narrative is taking over. So it's a fight against WhatsApp narrative of history. This evening, we are discussing a very important book by Hakim Samir Hamdani Sahab. The title of the book is The Syncretic Tradition of Islamic Religious Architecture of Kashmir, Early 14th to 18th Century. The chair of the session today is Rana Safi. Rana Safi is a passionate believer in India's Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, and which she documents through her writings, podcasts, and videos. And in 2011, she started the Twitter forum #Shire, which was responsible for popularizing Urdu online. And I also tweet sometimes on that with my favorite shades. She has published 7 books so far and on culture, history, monuments of India, which are bestsellers. Hakim Samir Hamdani Sahab is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT, Boston. He has been the design director at Intech Srinagar. Um, and with his primary research focused on Islamic architecture, he has published his work in various journals and also contributed book chapters. Among his major conservation projects that he has done are the reconstruction of the 18th century wooden shrine of Pir Dastagir Sahab and conservation of Ali Masjid al Eidgah in Srinagar, both of which were longlisted for the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. So, without further ado and without taking much time, I formally welcome the chair of the session, Rana Safi Appa, to continue the conversation. Thank you, Samir Saab and Rana Appa, for agreeing to do this conversation. Over to you, Appa.
Thank you so much, Ishan. And I must again congratulate you on this wonderful platform that you have built for all of us and the archives that you are building for students. Something so many scholars and professors, their lectures are so easily available for students. So that's a wonderful thing. And welcome, Samir, to this session. I'm looking forward to this discussion. And before I start, I must show the audience that this is the book that Samir has just recently published, The Syncretic Traditions of Islamic Religious Architecture of Kashmir from the early 14th to 18th century. It's a wonderful book which I would urge everybody to buy. It's available in all bookstores. The South Asian edition is available in bookstores and online. So Samir, without further ado, I'm going to get into the questions because I know there are going to be many comments and many questions for you after I finish. So my first question to you is that your book traces the historical identity of Kashmir within the context of the Islamic architecture of Kashmir, spanning the entirety of Muslim rule in the valley from its inception in the 14th century to the middle of the 18th century. That itself is a huge task. So, and you track monuments which people have not heard of, at least outside Kashmir. They must be very well known in Kashmir, I'm sure. So, how long did this book take you and what made you embark on such a project?
Firstly, thank you for having me and good evening, I think, to everyone in India. It's almost early morning around here. So, generally, the idea about what made me embark, I would say, it's a part of that process of self-discovery which happens. And in architecture, you're a bit sensitive about the fact that you have a certain cultural mooring where you are and how you're placed. So it was basically after finishing my graduation, I started looking again into Kashmiri architecture. So that fascination with Kashmiri architecture started not early on, but after my graduation. Once I came back to Kashmir and you're sort of working. In fact, you're looking for work, to be very honest, rather than working. And it is a time when, because of the political conditions in Kashmir, things had improved a bit. So you could actually move in and around Kashmir, both in the city and outside the city. So it was a part of a rediscovery of the geography of Kashmir as it is. And as a part of that rediscovery, I would say it was also part of the discovery of the architecture of the region. The interest in monumental or religious architecture, and that to Islamic religious architecture, it was a gradual build upon that very rediscovery happened during the course of my professional work also at INTAC, because I was involved in some projects regarding documentation or conservation of architecture buildings. In a nutshell, I could say the book itself is an outproduct of my thesis, so it happened in less than a year. But the what we call the research is a part of almost a decadal growth, if I could say it like that. So it's something interesting. It's more about your own self-discovery and connecting with your roots as it is.
That is something that comes out in your dedication itself. When I read the dedication and you dedicated to my family and the land that is home. So that itself, you know, I found very moving and touching, that the dedication, the way you written that dedication. And the land that is your home is also home to many influences, which we see in the architecture and the influences of the Central Asian trade networks, the past influences of Kashmir. And the title of your book is Syncretic. Itself talks of the syncretic framework of this architectural tradition. I know this is a question that you are asked often and you must have got tired of answering it, but I'm going to ask you again. The use of the word syncretic in the title of your book and the narrative of a history of conflict is the dominant theme in Kashmiri architecture and your book, Conflict or Coexistence.
I mean, it's true. If you see, I mean, primarily I would say if you see architecture, it's also an evidence of your past. It's a very solid and material evidence of how a society has evolved over a period of time. It's not only about a specific rule, but it's the general society as such it is. So I would say that if you look at these monuments, and one, you find that they're very rooted in a native identity. So that by itself is a point to ponder about. What is that makes this identity so strong enough that as the region sort of progressively moves from a Hindu to a Muslim society, that tradition, that link is not broken about. I mean, again, if you see the narratives of art or architectural histories written in India, and mostly these are colonial projects which speak about the break between a Buddhist architecture, a Hindu architecture, and an Islamic architecture. And if you then compare it to what's happening in Kashmir, Kashmir would be the strongest example in Southeast Asia to speak about a continuity. And that continuity is very much visible. It's like in your eyes out there, if you behold any old Khanka, any old mosque, and then you compare it to the temple that was there in the medieval period. So in all, I would say there is that sense of continuity, and which again speaks about the syncretic nature of society. Because if there is clash, if there is conflict, then architecture is also an important part of making that clash visible physically. I mean, you want to depart from something that was before, or something that you're against, or something that you're clashing with. But once you see a continuity in an architectural form, it also speaks about how traditions and cultural practices were basically not replaced. They might be slightly transformed, but there is that continuity which goes from one period to another. And this is what the book is about. But then again, that would not mean to say that there have not been periods of conflict in Kashmiri history or under Kashmiri Muslim rule. And in my book, I've alluded to that part also in terms of specificities, in terms of the buildings that were built upon older, maybe temple structures. But overall, I would say, as we say in South Asia, the mizaj of Kashmir was syncretic, and the architecture is something that speaks about it.
That's so very evident when you see the Jamia Masjid or even the Khankas, that this is local and this is not to do with the traditions of the rest of Hindustan. So another thing that, you know, when I'm talking of Khankas, is that the first thing that comes to mind when we talk of Kashmiri architecture are the Khankas. So was this due to the influence of Sufism for which Kashmir was famous? And can you describe the role of the Kashmiri Sufis linked with the Rishi order who effectively promoted preservation of pre-Islamic cultural symbols in face of an orthodox view emanating from non-native Persian-speaking Sufis? And I'm quoting you. How did architecture play a role in helping to assimilate past traditions within the boundaries of expanding Muslim community of Kashmir?
So let me start with the softer part of the question, which is about the Khanisas. If some of you must have definitely traveled to Kashmir, it's a much traveled place. So if you notice, barring Jamia Masjid, the larger historical Muslim places of worship are not your mosques, but these are Khankas. So as an institution, Khanka is different from a mosque, though primarily these days, you could say most of the khankas are operating more or less as a mosque, but historically these are different. So the centrality of Muslim religious practice or Muslim religiosity in Kashmir has always been a khanqa or a astan, a shrine, rather than a mosque. And it is something that you see in terms of the scales of the khanqahs, the monumental scale that is employed in the construction of these khanqahs as opposed to mosques, which are relatively very smaller. They would fit in a corner of a major khanqah. But then what is a khanqah? Khanqah is a place, uh, in the Arabic-speaking land, we have the Rabat, which is a rather very small place of reclusion. But in the Persianate world, you have this notion of a khanqah where each Sufi order is associated with the khanqah. It's almost like a seat of power or seat of prayer. And in that khanqah, you have both your communal practices in terms of the Panjgana Namaz, the five prayers, as well as solitary practices, which is you go into chilla. And then you also perform sama, wherever it is performed in whichever Sufi order. So in Kashmir, what you see is after maybe in around 15th century, the trend of setting up khanqahs gets really established. So your different Persian missionaries, Sufis coming into Kashmir, and as these different Sufis come and they are associated with different silsila, different orders, they establish their own khanqah. So these are, you could almost say, competing centers of spiritual power and also of patronage. So historically, khanqahs are places where you have a langar khana. So you offer food, you have a maktab wherein basically you teach, you introduce Islam to the land as it is, and then again the general overall practices. So more or less, khanqahs in Kashmir have eclipsed mosque as the central part of Muslim faith, at least in medieval period. And the Sufis who came were mostly from Persianate lands. So once they come to Kashmir, they are not only arriving as missionaries to preach, but they are also, in a way, harbingers of Persianate cultural influences. So somewhere they associate everything that is native to their Persian land as being Islam. So you also find that gradually there is a certain amount of reaction from the native Kashmiri Muslim community, and it happens in the form of the Rishi orders, who could almost be said to be a revolt against the creeping Persian influences. I mean, these are influences that are questioned even in the court politics, and the example of the Sadat al-Bahaqi would be a point there. But primarily in the spiritual landscape, you see that the Rishis evolve as an order in almost rejection of the Khanqah-based practice of the Sufis, whether these are Kubrawiyas or Sorwardiyas. So Rishis primarily don't have a Khanqah. So they never operated from a Khanqah. And again, if you see Rishis, it's a carryover from Rish, or in Kashmir, Rishi, the older Bhikshu tradition, whether of the Buddhist past or Hindu past. Most of the early Rishis are celibate. They never marry. They are vegetarian. They don't eat meat. And their places of worship are basically somewhere isolated in the rural landscape, away from the court power politics, the patronage of the court. So they are located in natural grottos or caves somewhere in the mountains. Now these have become major shrines, but that happened in 19th century. Initially at the point when they came into formation, these were, you could almost see, and the example of the poetry of Sheikh Nuruddin Alam would be a case in point, wherein they are questioning the traditions that are being imposed, Persianate cultures and cultural manifestations that are being imposed in the name of Islam. So you can see the Rishis are almost local folk expression of Islam as it happened in Kashmir.
You know, when I didn't know this part that the Rishis were celibate and did not eat meat, I wanted to visit Ashiq Muqam. And when I went there and I was told that you should not have eaten meat for a week. And I said, I've come to Kashmir, main to roz waazwaan kha rahi hu. So I decided next time I'll come and not, come on a vegetarian diet so that I can visit the various Rishi centers.
That's true. I remember once I was doing a project, we were in the South Kashmir in an area which is near Achbal, and basically there is this community of barns there. So then they have their sort of a patron saint, and we thought we would go up there. But we had a lunch with them, and they had cooked mutton was there a part of the lunch, and they said, no, you can't go because you had mutton. And apparently next to the shrine there is this spring, a nag, what we call a nag. And they say, if you go there and you have mutton or you have anything non-vegetarian, a serpent comes out. So it's better you don't go there. So we never tested the reality of that tradition, but I do accept it, as they said.
We should accept whatever tradition. When we are going to a place, then we have to accept the traditions of that place also. That's what I believe in. So, and when the thing, another thing that, especially when we're talking of Khankas and we talked about your award-winning projects, is the extensive use of wood in Kashmir. So that's the first thing that strikes you when you go to these buildings. So I wanted to talk to you as a conservator and as an architect. How difficult is the conservation of these monuments, and how is it being done? Because a few weeks ago or days ago, I remember you had posted a mosque or something had caught fire. So how do you, what is the plan in place for that?
I mean, even the sub-shrine that we rebuilt, primarily it was a loss because a historical monument was lost due to fire. And then not only that, I remember somewhere later on, we had an issue of lightning at Khan Kai Mola, a major monument of Muslim Kashmir. So that also, the spire got burned down due to fire. And I would say, as of now, what we lack is a disaster mitigation plan for these wooden monuments. We don't have one in place. And it is rather intriguing because the fact that Srinagar is now per se a smart city. So if you're making a smart city and you're spending so much money on billboard here and there, it's best you also invest a good amount of money in the protection of your monuments, because these are what talk about the past. Unfortunately, because as you rightly said, these are built in wood, we have already lost a huge part of the shrine across Kashmir. So there was a fire in Khrew wherein there was a temple that was burned down. Before that, we had the Sir Sahib shrine burned down. We had the Tsar, the major shrine at Tsar, which got burned down. We had a shrine at Tral, which got burned down. So these are major monuments, but then again, there are smaller cases as you refer to the small mosque I referred to. So overall, I would say that we don't have a disaster mitigation plan in place for both natural and man-made disasters. And this is something that we need to look at. Then again, in terms of conservation, wood decays. There's the issue of decay in wood. There's also slag, which happens in wood, this sort of dislocation of members. So overall, I would say we have issues both in terms of our planning and in terms of our preparedness for conservation of these monuments. And this is something, at least given the recent incidents we had, the amount of fires we had, at least the state should invest a certain amount of money into it.
And why was, for the benefit of the people who have joined us, why was wood used so extensively?
Because there are two very important considerations. One, wood as a material is easily available in Kashmir. So there is this story wherein they say even in 19th century, there was a forest right, which is known as Tashband in Fateh Qatal, which is the heart of the city. So imagine you have wood, it's easily available. Secondly, it's easily workable. Given the climatic conditions that we have in Kashmir, doing a masonry means that you can't do, historically, you could not do masonry structures during the winter months, primarily because of the frost. So with wood, it's easily manufacturable, it's easily fabricatable, and you can construct a same large span of an area in a lesser amount of time. Rather than doing domes and walls, doing a sort of a post and beam construction in wood is easier, it's more economical.
And durability is it matches obviously stone, because
durability in the sense, I would say, if you take care of it, there's no question. I mean, some of the monuments that survive, and Khanka is an example, it's somewhere from the early 18th century, and it's a huge, massive structure. But the question is, it needs a maintenance, sort of a weekly maintenance, a monthly, a quarterly, and a yearly maintenance. So these maintenance plans are no longer in place. And Awqaf, as the main institution which is heading these shrines, seems to be least interested in investing in the technical know-how of how to maintain these shrines.
That's very sad, because this is heritage of of international proportions, and something that should be looked after. And when we talk of wood, so the other thing that you notice is that when the Mughals came, they brought in stones. So like you have a Patthar Masjid and you have a Sangeet Darwaza. So what were the changes that the Mughals brought, and why? Didn't they know that wood was easier to work with? And the other thing is that why weren't they continued is the stonework of the Mughals. Was it because of what you term the community identity?
Yes, and it brings me to the first questionable part of the answer session, which is basically this is that initial relation between Delhi and Srinagar. How does Delhi view Srinagar and how does Srinagar view Delhi? So the Mughals were a part of a large empire. It was a rich, prosperous empire, and they invested in Kashmir. And the Mughal gardens in Kashmir are a classical example. I mean, you won't know much about the monuments that I'm speaking and writing about, but mostly people, at least across India, would have heard about the Mughal gardens of Kashmir. That is one prime attraction. If you go to Kashmir, Mughal Bagh dekhne or Mughal gardens dekhne. But then that again speaks about how Mughals viewed Kashmir. For Mughals from Akbar and all the way to Jahangir and then to Shah Jahan, there is this fascination with the land. They actually celebrate it. And they celebrate it as a Jannat, as a Parados, in their architecture, in their poetry. And you have huge examples of Persianate poets were associated with the Mughal court who came and started writing Masnavis in praise of Kashmir. But then there is a link between the Mughals and Kashmiris as a people. So you're celebrating the land, but you're almost celebrating it devoid of the people. So that relation between the Mughals and the Kashmiri doesn't happen as such. So once the Mughals built, and there's an interesting example at Zurich where they're building this Patthar Masjid. One would be a question of why. What was the need of building the mosque? Secondly, is the situation how you situate this mosque in the heart of Srinagar, opposite on the other bank, where you have one of the most historical Kashmiri buildings, which is the Khantai Mola. So here on one bank you have this building in wood, and on the other bank you make this Mughal Masjid in stone. And apparently it is a projection of Mughal empire, its resources, its power. You must understand, Mughals were not able to conquer Kashmir easily. I mean, they had to do it after repeated sort of invasions and political maneuvering. They finally managed to conquer Kashmir. So in a way, I would say that while they're building mosques, they're also saying to the locals, this is how you do a mosque. And because of the amount of munificence and the amount of resources that have gone into the construction of mosques, in a way, it's almost like a statement for future that Mughal rule is as sturdy, as solid as this mosque that is going to stay forever. But then again, in case of all the mosques that Mughals built, though they were used, but they never found a resonance with Kashmiri. Now, there are some people who would argue it's primarily because of the fact that these are spaces which are cold because it's a winter climate. But then if you see at Jamia Masjid, it has a certain same amount of spaciousness that is associated with Patthar Masjid. But Jamia always resonated with Kashmiris. The Mughal architecture in its totality never found favor with native Kashmiris. But as we move on from Mughals to Afghan period, we find there must have been a certain amount of nostalgia for Mughal rule because that was one of richness and opulence. Afghan rule was rather bad in that term. So you find certain elements that are Mughal architectural elements, features like the what you call the Sarvatham, the baluster column, or even the Shahjani arch. They are now becoming a part of the Kashmiri vernacular architecture, but primarily you're doing it in wood. So a masonry or stone arch is being redone in wood, but that is certain elements which find in resonance. But overall, you see that the two taraf never meet.
That's actually very well put. The connection between the Mughals and Kashmir and Delhi and Kashmir. Another thing is that, you know, over a period of time, and now I'm talking of the past, say, century, we again see the vernacular architecture changing. And as is in the case of Hadrat Bal, the earlier shrine was made of wood and pretty much like the khankas from what I can make out from the old photographs. But now they have something which could be anywhere in India, the marble dome and that shrine. So why do you think that has happened?
I mean, that's a very interesting and intriguing building case study, the reconstruction of the Hazrat Bal Shrine in 70s. And I was lucky enough to talk to engineer Shuja Hussain. So he was the engineer who was associated with the project. I have been trying to relocate the archival records from the architect's firm. So the architect was a very well-known Hyderabad-based architect. I don't remember his full name Behzad. So he was a major figure. He was associated with the Nizam, and then he came to Kashmir and did this building. In a way, you can say this is a very modernized version of a Mughal building. The references are to Taj Mahal. If you see the bulbous dome and the white marble, there is a certain apparent reference to Taj Mahal. But the question is why? I mean, because if you see the patron of the shrine, the person who was responsible for its reconstruction is Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah. And generally in Kashmir, Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah is seen as being representative of a certain Kashmiri nationalism. So he's associated with that Kashmiri identity. But then here he's responsible for giving patronage to a construction which takes away the Kashmiriness of the site and imposes this Mughal pan-Indian version of doing a mosque. So it's highly politically motivated or involved, the decision. But unfortunately, we have nothing written about the building, the design process. So we know how the reconstruction was responsible for reinventing Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah in the Kashmiri Muslim society. But the decision of redoing it, why? Is something that no one has ever spoken about. So we don't have a record from the architecture firm about the conversation that happened between them. What I would be able to understand from my talk with the engineer concerned with the project is, yes, there was this reference to Taj Mahal. Yes, we want to do something new. And look, it's a beautiful building. That's the way they put it. But the cultural ramifications of that project is something that's never been spoken about. So it's rather interesting, the question you put, and it's again a part of my present postdoc research to see how it fits it.
So that's very interesting. And the other thing is that everybody knows that you were, before you went for your postdoc, you were the design director for Intact. And I've seen your work there, and you were responsible for the restoration of the Khankai Dastagir, and as well as I think even Khankai Maula.
Yeah.
As well as the work where I saw you was at the Zadi Bal Imam Bada. So what fascinated me there was the Khatam Band, something which I actually didn't know about. And I'm sure many people who are watching us and listening to us today may not know what actually is Khatam Band. So can you just explain that for us and the difference between papier mâché and Khatam Band?
So let me start with paper mâché. Paper mâché by itself is a French term, papier mâché. So in Kashmir, it is basically the art of naqashi, the art of doing paintwork. And historically, it was known as Kare Kalamdan because it was done during this Seljuk period on Kalamdan. So you have these pen cases which were painted over and then sort of varnished over. So in Kashmir also, apparently it starts in the form of doing Kalamdan. So it was known as Kare Kalamdan, but it was also known as Kare Munakash, the work of the Naqash, because technically for Kashmiris, what we call paper mâché does not need to involve paper. It is whether you are doing naqashi, you're doing murals or you're doing artwork on any surface, whether it's a building surface, it's a ceiling, it's a wall, or even on paper molded surface. So that being said and done, the other part of it is basically about the Khatam Band. Khatam Band is basically an art form where you do geometrical patterns of small pieces, strips, and they are fitted together. It's mostly done in pine wood, which is one of the cheaper woods that is available in Kashmir. Now, regarding history of Khatam Band, while paper mâché, we could say, would have been there in the medieval period in 15th century. Historically, we assume that Khatam Band is also something that came in 15th century with Zain al-Abidin, but we have no textual reference to Khatam Band in Kashmir. We have no archaeological evidence of Khatam Band in Kashmir prior to 18th century reconstruction of Khankai Maula. So based upon what we know, it seems that the introduction happened because of the Mughals, but then because the material was so available in Kashmir and maybe the skill work, we used to do pinjakari. So basically it employs almost a similar sort of a girah or a pattern. So it is something that caught the fascination of the Kashmiri workers. And by 19th century, the art, the craft of Khatam Band was something that was virtually totally associated with Kashmir. So you see that examples of doing a Khataman in the Kashmiri style was also done in Lahore because of Kashmir's connection with the Ranjit Singh and the Lahore Darbar. So it again comes from the Mughal, is absorbed in Kashmir, and then from Kashmir during the 19th century, it goes into Punjab and other areas.
That's, it's very fascinating, and people very rarely understand the difference between the two. Also, as I remember you explaining it to me, that there's not a single nail or anything, it's all interwoven.
Exactly.
So that again
Exactly.
brings me to a question, another question that just struck me, was the term sacred geometry. So
Yeah,
how would you explain that?
I mean, it is so much a part of the overall. I mean, though the question is really question these days Islamic architecture as it is, how does geometry fit in there? I mean, in the sense whether it is in the planning, whether it is in the terms of the motifs, and whether because of this apparent ban on figurative depiction, how it involves in these mirrored forms of geometrical motifs that are employed in ceilings, in then even on your book paper, on the margins of an album. I mean, it is something that's been so much spoken about, so much written about, this whole notion of sacred geometry. Now, coming from that part wherein it deals with the motifs and how they are created, it again is an example of the advancement of mathematical skills and knowledge. So at a certain point, it became more of a craft practice. But initially, I mean, if you see some of the pinjas that are there in Kashmir, you'll find that they need to be done only once you have a you're very grounded in geometry and advanced geometry. Some of these patterns are so complicated. I mean, if I ask an artisan to do it just like that, I mean, he would patterns that have not been involved for some years, and they are really incapable of doing it. So it again speaks about the knowledge, the mathematical knowledge that is involved, the geometrical knowledge that is involved in some of these designs. And then again, there are people who have written about, like you would have Said Nasser or Lala Bakhtiar, others who are speaking about how they talk about the unity of form, and that unity, how that gets connected to the Ibn Arabi sort of mystical world. But that is something that I'm primarily not very comfortable, and I don't really accept it at many places. But there is that notion of secretness associated with geometry, wherein the point is what do you call the bindu, the starting point, and then from there everything comes about. But then these are philosophical debates. I'm very much grounded in the material culture.
I'll just come to the research that you are doing. I have one more question before we come to that. Just as the Hazrat Bal Shrine stands out for its distinct architecture, the tomb of Zainul Abidin's mother, I'm forgetting what that area is called just now, that also stands out as very, very different. And I've talked to you about it, and you told me the influences that are reflected in that monument. Can you just take us through that monument?
So that is basically, it's a place known as Mazar-e-Salatin, and the tomb itself, the mausoleum itself, is known as Dumat. In Kashmiri, we call it Dumat. It's basically, the construction happens during the reign of Sultan Zainul Abidin. So he is this 15th century Sultan of Kashmir. I mean, who's really one great king that emerges, not because of his political or military prowess, but because of how cultured and sympathetic he is. I mean, his whole Darbar, his court is so sympathetic in terms of the amount of patronage he gives. So basically, this is the period when, if I'm correct, Ramayana gets translated into Persian. This happens way before Akbar does it in mainland India. So his patronage of both Hindus and Muslims and both scriptures is something that is really interesting. But now coming back to the monument, this is also a period wherein there is a certain amount of experimentation happening. So he is a person who is giving patronage to local architecture, and the example of Madni's Mosque is one such case. But then, because of this infusion of Persianate missionaries, and these are not just missionaries, but also artisans, masons, etc., this results in this experimentation wherein you're taking from the Timurid architecture pattern. So the building by itself is based upon that very prominent Timurid practice. You have the high-pitched arch, then you have the notion of even decorating the exteriors, rather than doing a sort of tile work, as would be the normal practice in Samarkand or somewhere else. You have these polychromatic blue turquoise tiles all studded in the walls. So this is something which speaks about the experimentation that was happening in Zainul Abidin's time. This is the period wherein certain arts and crafts like paper mache, Pinjakari, etc., were basically, they come into Kashmir because of the patronage that Zainal Abidin is offering. So it is more or less a part of that experimentation which happens in Zainal Abidin's time. And there is another surviving monument from this time at Sogra, wherein again you have a dome structure. So these are very few dome structures that were built historically by Muslims in Kashmir. One example is the one that was you referred to. But basically, it speaks about how Kashmir was opening more and more towards influences coming from the West. And because that is seen as the cultural capital of Muslim world at that part, at least the eastern part. So you're imbibing ideas from that part. So this process is more or less that transmission of ideas, design motifs, etc. But then again, he also carries over the patronage of local architecture as it was.
So, like for me, when I went there, and after having visited all the khankas and the Jamia Masjid, etc., it seemed like, like I'm in a different world. And to me, it looked like one of those European cathedrals. And I asked you about it, and you explained the various influences. Yes, of course, Gure Amir does resemble this also. So that you told me about the Timurid influences. And I remember that whole conversation. And, I found that, how should I say? I won't say that I found that the most beautiful, but I found it very striking. For me, of course, the most beautiful monument there was Khankai Mola. And in your book, you have this drawing or a photograph of the shoreline of the Jhelum, in which you've given all the various monuments, and you name all the monuments over there. That's very beautiful. However, you took the photograph, that is, I suppose, your skill. But can you just talk to us about the reason why Jhelum was so important and why there are so many shrines and mosques along the river?
So primarily, Srinagar is a river-based town. I mean, river is the lifeline from the town, and away till almost early, I would say, 20th century, most of your transportation of material and people happen along the Jhelum. So naturally, it's your major highway. So buildings will be built upon that highway. So that is the reason why most of our historical built form is located along the spine of the river Jhelum. Most of our major towns are basically based on the Jhelum, whether it is Srinagar, whether it's Bijbehara, whether it's down south or up north, wherever you go. So historically, you would say that in Srinagar, you have this whole river front, and it is interspersed between residences and khankas and mosques. So overall, even today, after almost today in 2021, and there have been so many changes, so many buildings have been lost, so many buildings have been rebuilt, but you still see the coherence of that riverfront. And if you compare it some of the earlier pictures that we have from the early part of the 20th century, and if you compare to, though there is a difference, there is a material loss, but overall you can see that character, that sense of character to the place is still there as it was. And overall it again shows about the presence, how a mosque and a temple and a khanka and a residence juxtaposition along that riverfront. It speaks about that syncretism in more than many ways. I mean, you're going down to the Ghat and you're doing your evolution, whether you are a Hindu or you're a Muslim. And in fact, there is this painting from, I think, 18 something. It's a company art painting, wherein you find on the opposite bank here Khanka Bola, and on the Pathar Masjid bank, there are a group of Kashmiri Pandits who are doing their rituals. So it speaks about that syncretedness that became a part of Kashmiri culture.
I'm just trying to look for that photograph. Do you remember offhand the page?
It will be within the color plates. That much I'm sure. So the color plates are all together.
Yes.
So it will be good.
So this is it, the one on top. So this is what I found this very beautiful. This whole the whole image, and this is for those who are watching. This is the building we talked about before. Dumat, you said, no?
Yeah, we call it Dumat.
And here are the Pathar Masjid of Noor Jahan. If anyone has any question, I'm sure Samir would be happy to answer. And till then, Samir, can you just tell us before we wrap up, if there are no questions, which is your favorite building there?
So there is this is very small building which is known as Mir Masjid. It's located in Pampur. very small, but it has this heavy wooden eaves, and it's again the earliest example of a mosque in Kashmir which survives in totality. So it's very modest, unassuming, but there's a certain richness to the building as it is, and I simply love that building.
Have you restored it?
No, unfortunately, a part of that building has been demolished because it's a part of a local mohalla committee. So we were able to, at Interact, we were able to stop the complete demolition. There was even a legal case happening along that site, but a part has been demolished. So this is basically wherein we can also speak about the fact that how much of respect we have past. One does recognize the fact that these are functional places of worship, but then historically we have been able to cater to a need, to a larger congregation need without demolishing buildings. But these are issues that are a part, at least for many of these functional places of worship throughout, I would say, South Asia. How do you cater to the need of an expanding community or the utilities that they needed? How do you cater to it? I mean, I would say an example would be the Jamia Masjid. So some years back, almost a decade back, they had introduced these aluminum frames in the windows, primarily because the congregation had said that winter it gets a bit cold. We were able to talk to the Mir Wise, and we told him, I mean, Kashmiris have been living with this mosque for almost how many years now? Since 15th century. 15th centuries, at points in that part of history, we were poor. We couldn't hardly afford a decent piece of clothing, yet we managed to worship there. We never felt that cold in all these years. And now all of a sudden, people are with all these facilities, with the heating and etc., you feel the cold. He was sympathetic to the point that recently they removed all those additions and alterations.
Really, I think most of these monuments need champions, and they have one great one in you. Which also brings me to the question which I face very often here when I go to Delhi monuments and document them. How much of heartbreak is there when you are in love with monuments?
Yeah, there is. But at the point, I also accept the fact that monuments are something which don't belong to a person. Like, for example, we did the Dazir Sahib shrine. Recently, I went there and found that you have these paper mache on the wall. And on top of it, someone has donated a very garish piece of something which has been put on the wall. You feel bad, but then you also understand that this is where the community is owning the building as such. You can only sanitize them to how to do it, but the responsibility is with the community. You can never dictate to them, don't do this. That would take that sense of belonging and ownership of the building. So it's a very hard balance. And as a person who's from the conservation field, you feel you're on the losing side of the argument as it is. But you can always argue, and that's the best thing. I mean, you can make people more knowledgeable about how to do it. You cannot question the sentiments. I mean, again, in the case of the building that I talked about, many of these alterations or additions, which are very unsympathetic, they happen out of a sense of piety and association with the buildings. They don't do it to harm the building. It's done out of aqidah, if I would say. It is done out of your jazba. But the way it is done is what is harmful. So more or less, it's for us as organizations and individuals to apprise the people about what should be done and should not be done in a historical built fabric. But I would not be comfortable in dictating that you don't do it.
And I agree, because something that's a subject very close to my heart also, and I know that you are so deeply involved in it. And would you like to tell us a little bit about your postdoc, or is that under wraps at the moment?
No, nothing is under wraps. Why should it be under wraps? So it's basically
don't like talking about their work while they're doing it. I don't like talking about it while they're doing a project.
I mean, if someone else is also interested, it's good. Why not? Basically, the book, as you notice, it ends at 18th century. And that's something a conscious decision, because I see that as the ending of the extended medieval period in Kashmir. So 19th century is when the rule transforms to a non-Muslim rule for the first time in history, after the Muslims come to Kashmir. And this is again a period wherein you have this advancing colonialism, you have colonial impacts and influences, and then this sort of whole debates about the formation of nation state, what should happen to the future of South Asia. So the postdoc is about politics and religion at the intersection in 19th century. So it's another interesting thing happening.
Again, an interesting time, because you have the Sikh rule and the Dogras and all that, and a lot of things happen.
I thought I ended before 47.
I think that is right. You concentrate on the material remains. So I am wondering if there are any questions. Ishan, are there any questions?
I'm back. Yes. Yes, there are questions, Apa, and I'll read them out.
Please.
So this is by Tara Hasnan Sahiba. Sandeep, can you talk about what happened to the valley's Islamic monuments during the decades Sikh and Dogra rule? And did these rulers help to repair and maintain such monuments?
So in terms of Sikh rule, I mean, generally you'd see that Sikh rule is very brief in Kashmir. It doesn't happen for a long period of time. But primarily when they come over, what happens is at least they close down the Jamia Masjid and the Khanqah Mohalla. There is this issue of a threat to demolish Khanqah Mohalla. Luckily, it doesn't happen. But what you'd say that for the majority of Sikh rule, they are disinterested in Muslim material culture or places of worship. But towards the end of the Sikh rule, we have two Punjabis, Muslims who serve as governor of Kashmir, the Subedars of Kashmir, Sheikh Gulamuddin and his son Imamuddin. Now, these are the two gentlemen who are responsible for giving Jagirs to Kashmiris once again, and they are also responsible for a certain amount of limited patronage of major places of Muslim worship in Srinagar city. One being the Ziyarat of Makhdoom Sahib. Second, again, the case would be Khanqah Mohalla. In Dogra period, you again see there is, and this is something that Mritu Roy has also documented in her book about that tussle between Muslims as well as the Dogra, Muslim community as well as the Dogra government or Sarkar. And briefly, towards the end of Pratap Singh's period and in Hari Singh's period, we find that there's a certain amount of patronage that happens to Jamia Masjid. So the state does get involved in the conservation preservation project of the Jamia Masjid. But then this is again, which is happening because of a certain amount of political pressure coming from the Muslim community, some involvement from the local residents. So it's happening there, but more or less you'd say that to a certain extent, the Dogras were rather disinterested, as were the Sikhs. But then in certain cases, there was a certain political and almost religious interference of the Dogra Sarkar in terms of how buildings should be. For example, we have the case of Pattar Masjid. It was closed. So at a certain point, Pratap Singh came with the idea of converting into an orphanage and to name it after the Hindu deity Lord Hanuman. So these are things that became a point of conflict as we come to 20th century.
Thank you so much for that answer. The next question is by Rasik Aswara, and he asks that how monuments tell about the common people through architectural perspective.
I mean, personally, monuments are built to glorify a power rather than the common people. Let's be very honest about it. Monuments were never made about common people. But then the art, workmanship, the craftsmanship that comes from the common people, right? So if you compare Tadi, it is the outpouring of the craftsmen who are from the society as such. But in the end, these are more about to glorify an image of a king or a sultan or a religious order or a religious function rather than the people itself. If you talk about people per se, then you need to go back to the vernacular. You don't find much traces in monumental architecture. And this is a sort of a phenomenon that happens everywhere. It's not limited to Kashmir.
That's very true. One last question for the evening. This is by Tara Hasnan Sahib again. And this question is, does the Islamic community feel sad that the new Islamic structures coming up are pan-Islamic and losing their specifically Kashmiri elements? And what are some of these elements in your opinion?
I mean, if you see a majority of buildings that are being constructed, the majority of mosques in Kashmir, they would be with a dome and minaret. And let me also say that I have done a couple of mosques, and one of the mosques, I also had to do a dome and minaret. I argued with the client that let's do something Kashmiri, but then they never accepted it. And probably because they're far more invested in this whole notion of doing minarets and domes. Why? It's not always something about political or religious aspirations. Sometimes it's also symbolic, or sometimes a question of novelty, doing something that was not done before. I mean, यहाँ पे you never used to make a mosque with dome and minar, let me make it. It's also sometimes a question of competition between, there is a mosque on the road further up, it has a dome and minar, so let's make bigger. So these are so many things that are happening. It's more about how the society is seeing itself. Is there an awareness about doing Kashmiri mosque in an idiom which is native, locally rooted? I would say yes, there are certain interesting examples coming up. One is a mosque that was recently constructed on the Bund, post flood of 2015, and it is done in a very eclectic native architectural style. So it happens there. There is the major shrine, which is at Azhar Sharif, which was burned down during the turmoil of the 90s. And initially, once they decided to rebuild it, the idea was to do a building like the Hazrat Bal with the dome and minar. But then, because of creeping sort of some conversation that happened, they redid it. The end resulted more of a kish rather than something nice and beautiful. But again, that is again a building that at least they have attempted to do it in a Kashmiri medium. So there are these contra trends also, wherein there is not a spoken need, but a visual identification with certain, and the examples would be a spire. The most prominent example of Kashmiri architecture is the spire as the most dominating visually function there. So the idea to do buildings which are more not traditional, but basically which are basically reworking on that traditional style of doing khanqahs and mosques. So it is something that will happen, but then there are changes also. So overall, I would say if there are mosques built, a vast majority of them would be built in a non-native idiom.
And a question that I would ask you to kind of wrap the session with, the term Islamic architecture is sometimes, is under scrutiny because how can we specify the features that are Islamic? Because arches, domes, minarets are not the inventions, of the Muslim community. Romans made it, and it is used in churches in the Europe. So how can you define Islamic architecture?
You are quite right. I mean, after Marshall Hodgson, the whole idea of Islamic architecture came into question. But primarily, as far as I'm concerned, I'm dealing with religious architecture. So religious architecture is Islamic per se. It's more when you're talking about palaces and sarais, etc. The term normally these days we use is Islamicate rather than Islamic. So it's an outpouring of a community where either the majority community is Muslim, or maybe the majority or the rulers were Muslim, the patronage came from Muslim. But again, you're quite right. How do you differentiate between a Jarokha, which is maybe not of a even a Mughal origin in a Mughal building, what makes it, or a Bangla roof which comes from Bengal and then gets incorporated in the architecture of Shah Jahan. So I would say there is a gradual awareness of that fact, and that's why outside of religious architecture, you don't find people using the word Islamic architecture these days. But then the very term Islamicate is also so wide and open. It's also contentious. I mean, because then the question would be you're taking something away from societies which were predominantly Muslim by questioning these architectures. So, I mean, I think this is a debate that will go to and fro to a certain extent before we come to a final concluding point on where we stand. But as of now, yes, you're correct in terms of the outpourings of Muslim empires or Muslim societies. The term Islamicate is more that is used rather than Islamic.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Rana Appa, for conducting such an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Sameer Saab, for such beautiful answers.
I've really enjoyed the evening, and it was a wonderful session.
I just started my morning, so thanks a lot.
Now today must be Sunday for you.
Yeah, it's Sunday, but it's a bit gloomy and cloudy. We're having nice fall weather. Okay. But today it's a bit cloudy.
I hope somebody from Boston also joined us, and they can invite you over.
And those who are watching us, I would just remind them that this book is available. It's called The Syncretic Traditions of Islamic Religious Architecture of Kashmir, that you must buy and read. And you can send your reviews to Karwan, to Sameer Saab directly through email. We would love to read them. And I look forward to reading the book. I'm going to order it just now after this session.
Thank you.
There's so much to learn about Kashmir. We really do not talk about in mainstream history, unfortunately. But there is growing interest in that part of India, and we look forward to reading these books. Thank you so much, sir, for your scholarship.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And I'll end the live now. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. Don't forget to subscribe to Carvaan. Have a great evening.